I'll just start. Does anybody have any questions about... No. Does anybody have any questions about your grade and critique from the portrait assignment that you want to air in a public forum? I would assume that if you had ones that you needed to keep private, you would have emailed me, but I also presume maybe there's no questions, which is fine. I like to think the critiques are fairly straightforward. I said at the beginning, I'll reiterate, my critiques will maybe seem kind of harsh. The grade is not going to be particularly harsh. It's unrealistic to expect anyone in a 1-credit, very basic survey class to be producing high-level work. So I'm going to critique so that hopefully you learn from the critique, but grade really just the only time I'm going to be deducting points if there are things that I consider to be kind of egregious enough. The biggest, I think, failing almost across the board was in captions. I sort of expect that you could look at the caption examples I gave you and emulate that. So if you didn't emulate that caption style pretty well, you're going to lose that point. None of that's going to, I think, kill anybody in the long run, but it's an important thing, especially since captions are writing. Your journalism majors, most of your other courses are writing. I'd like to think that you'll be able to meet that standard in general. So we're going to look at the portrait photos, so I'll kind of share a little of the critique widely so you all see a little various examples of what was out there. I will also say it now, wait till after we look at portraits. Let's look at portraits first. You'll see some examples. I recropped a few people's pictures, so I'll show you the original, I'll show you the recrop. That's just a situation where if I saw something different that could be done with just that photo, ideally, I'm not going to be able to do that very often because either you shot particularly tight and there's no recropping to do, or maybe, maybe it's perfect in the first place. We can cross our fingers, right? So, real quick example. Like I said with the environmental portrait, you're just going to take a picture of a person in whatever setting is appropriate to their storyline. This is a person who works in an office. They're in their office. I would suggest, whenever possible, unless there's something about their desk that's really compelling, don't put them behind their desk. I like to take pictures of people in front of their desks, literally, for example. Standing in front of their desk, leaning on it, sometimes with the arms crossed, sometimes back on the desk. It just changes the body language a little bit. Another example is it steps them a little bit away from whatever's behind the desk that you're using as the contextualizing background. Drops it a little bit into the background, not so far that it drops out of focus, you can't tell what it is, but far enough it gives a little separation. The biggest complaint with this photograph is the big, giant white window that's kind of in the middle of the frame. In this case, ideally you would have moved away from the window however you could. There's nothing going on outside the window that tells a particular story. If the person works in an office and is, a supervisor of student activities, but you can't photograph them supervising student activities, but there's a student activity going outside out the window, that's different. But in this case, there's nothing but cold ground and harsh light. So a recrop in this case is kind of a bare minimum. More ideally would be to switch the point of view entirely so that the window was not creating this big distracting element. So I'll talk about that a lot over the course of the semester. Pay attention to what's around the edges of your frames because you don't want sort of distracting things sneaking in from the edges, but also pay attention to whatever the 800-pound gorilla is in the middle of your frame, whether or not it's distracting from your subject visually or contextually. If there's something going on in the background of your photo that's not relevant to what you're trying to tell in the photograph, move so it's not there, recrop it, reframe. So this is another sort of similar example. Geography major, really appropriate to use the maps as the backdrop, but the desk and the couch or bed in the background are not really important to the photograph, other than to say that it's in a dorm room, but more ideally, a tighter crop. You could have done a whole lot of different things with the pose. He could have been sitting on the edge of the bed, a little sideways. He could be filling up that dead space there on the right where there isn't a map, maybe. Maybe a little bit looking sideways, looking towards the left where the light's coming, rather closer to the light so that the light's not great either. That's a difficulty. Dorm rooms are pretty bad. If someone's got a nice movable lamp, move it around so it's bouncing off a wall and softening the light. I'm pretty sure I said in the lighting part, the size of your light source is going to make a big difference in how harsh your light is. The sun up in the sky is nonetheless a very small light source. The minute you put a bunch of clouds in front of it, the light diffuses and you get a much softer, much larger light source. Studio photographers use a thing called a softbox, which is literally a tent that, depending on the size of the studio and the portability, can be 6 feet tall, and it's got a bunch of diffusion material in it, so the little lighting source in the back bounces off all that lighting material and gives you a very soft light. So, once again, whatever you can do to soften the light if it's appropriate. Another person in front of posters, the only thing I would have said, crazy idea, turn the couch around and have the person with the guitar sitting on the back of the couch so that he's raised up so that the posters form the background. Pull them a little farther away if you can so that they're a little more backgroundy and not so dominant. Other than that, this is really, the light's nice, the pose is nice, the smile's nice, really nice. I said about this one, probably wanted to turn the camera horizontally. I don't know for sure. I don't know this space too intimately. I've been in there once when I was looking for something on my father's time as a pharmacy student at UConn. I believe those shelves spread out a little wider, so a horizontal frame would have given you a little more context maybe. Once again, pull the person away from the background a little bit maybe. Lots of other ideas. Nonetheless, clean, sharp, the light's good. I like to ask people to go ahead and take their masks off for just a second so I can get a picture, just so we can see the full face. But, that's your comfort level with defying those rules is going to be kind of up to you on what you feel you can get away with in that sort of situation. I think this is an interesting, different way of doing this. This is less of an environmental portrait per se, I think, because I'm not sure the roses are entirely storytelling. It is Valentine's Day. I think I suggested just a little wider out. It's really tight, really intimate. It might be a little bit unnerving to people. Otherwise, though, I like the imagination of sticking her face in the roses. So I think that's nice. So to start, I really love the framing, the use of the slats on the bunk bed as a framing element, really dynamite. Whenever you can, framing elements or the framing style of composition can be very useful. Narrows the focus to the subject without using shallow depth of field or any sort of lighting techniques. The only problem I have with this, and I'll say it another one too, if it's a posed photo, it needs to be a posed photo. The person needs to be either looking at the camera or looking in a way that makes it clear that they are not actually doing what they're doing. If this is a candid photo, then it's not really a portrait the way I assigned a portrait, right? All of the examples I showed you were people looking at the camera. We talked about the difference between a setup photograph and a candid photograph. So it's a minor thing, it's a learning element. Everything we're doing for the rest of this semester is going to be candid photographs, and as a candid photograph, if that's what this is, it's really very nice. If it's a portrait, it's not quite right. So, same thing with this one. The setting is great. I'll talk about the leading lines in a moment with the next example, because it's obviously a popular spot. Really good use of context. College students, rows of books. I think maybe a little cliche and yet really nice effect. If it's a portrait, he needs to be looking at the camera. Just look up from the book and, either smile or don't smile, whatever you want. So, and then here we have the reverse. This person is looking at the camera, so this is very much a portrait. I'll just say really quickly, the door behind him is maybe a little distracting. You could crop down. In this case, the background is very clean. the shallow depth of field, and I don't know if that's because it's an actual camera that does shallow depth of field or if it's portrait mode. It doesn't matter overall, but it's very clean, very engaging. The eyes, the expression, the body language, and then the leading lines of the shelves are really dynamite. So, any questions sort of on what you heard there? Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how photography happens, the elements that go into the technical aspects of photography. I used the word depth of field. I think I may have mentioned depth of field on the first or second day, but I didn't talk much about it, so I want to talk a little bit about where that comes into play. The portrait mode in the smartphone camera is something that simulates a shallow depth of field, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So we're going to talk about the elements that go into the photographic exposure. This is just a frame grab from my smartphone camera, so you can see two of the three main elements are right there on the screen on the left-hand side. The bottom one is the shutter speed, which is the duration of time that the camera is making the exposure. In old-fashioned cameras like the one I carry every day and the ones that used to take film, the shutter speed was actually determined by a mechanical leaf moving out of the way of the film plane and then moving back in. How long that did was what you called the shutter speed, and it could range anywhere from a 40th of a second up to my cameras do 1/8,000th of a second. You can actually set cameras to hold that shutter open for a very long time, for seconds and minutes, depending on what kind of photography you're doing. So, and the other one on display up there is the ISO, which is the sensitivity of the sensor, or the film medium. Whatever's recording your image has a certain sensitivity to light. In the film days, a roll of film, a piece of film, had one sensitivity, and that's all it had. Now that we have digital, the sensor can actually change its sensitivity from frame to frame to frame. Your smartphones will literally change sensitivity all the time, because the one element that's not visible on this screen is the aperture, which is the opening in the lens that allows the light through. And that's not there because your smartphone does not have a variable aperture. The opening in the lens on your smartphone is the same all the time. So your camera will change the ISO largely instead of what a real camera, I'll go ahead and use real this time because those elements are there, instead of changing aperture. So these are the basic three elements of your photographic image. I like to use a tripod as my analogy. A lot of illustrations use a triangle, pretty obvious, but a tripod is a photographic tool, so therefore I went with the tripod. So your aperture is your lens opening, the shutter speed is the duration of your exposure, and the ISO is the sensitivity of the imaging medium, a film or a digital sensor. This is a nice little cheat sheet to look at. Can tell you a little bit about the basics of those three elements. I'm going to break them down for you, but once again, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So this is just a picture of the actual aperture in a camera lens. This is an illustration that just shows you what the numbers roughly correspond to. The smaller the number, the wider the opening, and therefore the more light is allowed through. So the larger the number, the smaller the opening, the less light gets through. All right. Once again, the aperture on your smartphone doesn't change. So you don't have this on your smartphone, but if you've got an SLR of some sort, you have the ability to change the aperture anytime you take a picture. But in addition to letting the amount of light that gets through, the aperture has an effect on something that's called depth of field. All right. This is an illustration here at the bottom, tells you what it is. The smaller the opening, the depth of field becomes deeper. And depth of field is basically the amount of information that is in focus both in front of and behind the plane of focus. So a camera lens focuses at one point, 10 or 15 feet away. The depth of field determines how much in front of and behind that is also in focus, or at least appearing in focus. So the smaller the aperture, the deeper the depth of field, The wider the aperture, the shallower the depth of field. The focal length of your lens, which is basically the distance from the imaging plane and the back element of the camera lens, or the camera lens if it's a single lens, will also have an effect on depth of field, and we will get to that momentarily. Here's another illustration on depth of field, just so you can see. The top one shows you a narrow, I prefer the term shallow, but whichever depth of field. The camera is focused at the distance of the animal. I'm going to go with it's a lynx because it has no tail. So a narrow depth of field is just that little bit of space, and then a much smaller aperture would increase that depth of field a great deal. If you want your subject to be isolated against its background, you would go with a wider aperture, shallow the depth of field so that the background of your photograph will drop out of focus. Very common in outdoor portrait photography to use a certain kind of lens that increases the shallowness of depth of field, and then make sure you have a background that is far away, hundreds of yards, miles, whatever it is, so the subject of your photograph is tack sharp, but they're against sort of a blurry, soft background. So just an example of a shallow depth of field. The story is about body cameras at the police department, so the focus is right there on the body camera. In this case, there's just enough detail in the background that you can pretty much figure out those are police officers, right? This is a deep depth of field, all right? Basically everything in that photograph, even the ship that's a couple, several miles away, are pretty sharp. So that's a very deep depth of field. So hold on a second, I'll dry out here. So the focal length of the lens has a number of different things that come into play. First of all, the focal length of the lens determines your field of view, okay? What we call a wide lens, because it has a wide field of view, some will also call a short lens. A wide-angle lens includes more information in the frame. A long lens or a telephoto lens includes a much smaller amount of information. Depth of field is affected correspondingly. The wider the field of view of a lens, the inherent depth of field is deeper. So a wide-angle lens is going to have a very deep depth of field regardless of what your aperture is. Even wide open, standing right here, if I have a wide-angle lens on all of you, even at wide open aperture, you're all going to be relatively in focus. But if I get a telephoto lens out and I narrow it down and I take Caitlin's picture here with that telephoto lens, everybody in the row behind her is going to drop out successively farther out of focus. Now, you can change the aperture to get a deeper depth of field, and if I go with that wide lens and I go with a much smaller aperture, you're going to get sharper and sharper in the distance. With the telephoto lens, once again, smaller aperture, I can get a deeper depth of field, but the overall depth of that depth of field, the distance of that depth of field, is going to be much smaller with the telephoto lens. So even at the very smallest aperture I have right here, in the end, Caitlin and John?
Yeah.
Oh gosh. I got it at least. Caitlin and John will be in focus, but Marissa will still not be, right? So that's the thing that comes into play when you're working with a camera with variable lenses, is you have to pay attention to both the lens effect and the aperture effect on your depth of field. So this is just a quick study in basic perspective. This is standing in the same spot with my iPhone and just changing the perspective field. So this is the widest setting, the next widest setting, the normal setting, and then the ultra zoom. Now, technically, now as cell phone cameras are having multiple lenses, some of this is actually done with lens changes. Some of this is really just done with in cropping in the camera. Nonetheless, you're still getting a sense of the difference in the perspective that's available to you. Before we had zoom lenses, before cell phones had different lenses, you know how you had to do this? Like this. Take a picture here, take a picture here, and take a picture here, okay? Your smartphone isn't going to have a whole lot of zoom. I mean, the most zoom your smartphone has is still not a lot. So sometimes you still got to move your feet and get a lot closer to get good close-up detail. Real quick over shutter speed. As I said, it can be measured anywhere from minutes and seconds to tiny fractions of a second. The primary thing that shutter speed does is stops action, right? So if you're taking pictures of moving subjects, you want a higher shutter speed. If your subjects are not moving, the only concern with shutter speed is how steady you can hold your camera. If you're going with very slow shutter speeds, your subjects are not moving, you might use that aforementioned tripod, which allows you to mount the camera on it, and the camera will hold very still. So once again, your phone is going to do most of this for you. If you have a more advanced app, you may have the ability to have some control, maybe to tell it to go with a higher shutter speed to try and stop action. So, examples. Slow shutter speed. These guys are not moving very fast. They're just marching at about walking pace, but it's a very slow shutter speed. The camera is braced on a tree, if you're wondering how I managed to avoid the building in the background also blurry. Sports is an especially common place where high shutter speeds are used. This is 1,000th of a second. So the ball you can see still has a little blur in it. It's moving considerably faster than the soccer players. And then the last element is ISO. If you're wondering, ISO stands for International Standards Organization. For a very long time in America, we referred to the sensitivity by the term ASA, which was the American Standards Association. We finally decided to stop using ASA, and now everybody uses ISO. The higher the ISO, the less light you need to make the exposure. The lower the ISO, the more light you need. How you get more or less light depends on what you want to change. All right, if you're at 800 ISO, you need a corresponding balance of your aperture and your shutter speed. If you want more shutter speed, then you need to open the aperture up to let light in. If you want more depth of field and therefore a small aperture, you need a slower shutter speed to allow the image to be recorded for a longer period of time. And that whole concept is called reciprocity, and I don't expect you to fully understand it in 15 minutes of me talking, but the big takeaway from ISO, and this is becoming less important, the higher the ISO, the lower the quality of your image is going to be. Smartphone cameras have a particularly trouble with low light situations, high ISOs. You get what's called noise. The image starts to look kind of grainy and fuzzy. There are cameras where the apps do better at low light. They're getting better in general. A large part in digital photography, the physical size of the sensor that you're recording on will actually affect the light sensitivity overall and reduce noise. So if you're using a big expensive SLR with a sensor that's considerably bigger than a postage stamp, you have better luck with low light. My cameras, I will shoot at ISOs like that 12,800 and still get entirely usable photographs. Your smartphones, the sensor is, about that big. It's not going to respond as well in low light, but you also don't have a lot of control over the ISO. This is an example of a very high ISO. This was about 3,200, but it's also a long exposure with a fairly deep depth of field, a fairly small aperture. But as you can see in this case, there's basically no digital noise, which is nice. Truth is, I actually looked for an example, and I'm not sure I have any really handy. I have to go into my archives. The digital cameras have gotten so good that I use now. I don't really have a problem with ISO. So that's that end of things. Any questions about the general concepts I covered? Anybody have sort of a vague idea what I was talking about? You'll never quite look at your camera exactly the same way again. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, let's see if I can find this. So I haven't had a chance to look at the first news photos that came in for this week. So not going to speak on those. But we will review them like we did with the portraits. But I did want to talk a little bit about taking photographs, a little bit about the ideas behind the assignment. What I wanted to reiterate a little bit, because I sort of touched on it, I think, last week when it came to talking about the news assignment. I'm not really worried about a real hard news value line, okay? Don't worry about whether or not what you're taking a picture of is going to be good enough to run on the front page of the New York Times or even the New London Day or even really the Daily Campus. The real exercise is about getting out and capturing candid moments, okay? I'm more worried that you're looking at your composition, that you're looking at capturing that slice of life. So if what you find yourself photographing is a student playing Frisbee, that's great, all right? Work on the composition, work on the moment, work on paying attention to where the light's coming from and how that's affecting your photograph. Worry a lot less about whether or not you're taking something that's really newsworthy. That said, anytime you're going to be photographing something that is going to be newsworthy, you're going to be looking very hard at what the moment is, whether it is telling the story, whether you are conveying the emotions and experiences of the people that are in the photographs. One of the things that I need to emphasize, and I probably should have done this before you started, it's okay, we're all learning here. Don't take just one picture, okay? Never take just one picture. It's almost, the great news photographers of, 75 years ago, yeah, sure, they had one piece of film in the camera and they had to go pop and that had to be it. And sometimes they got it really great. Ouija and his F8 and B there, all that was great. We're not limited by that anymore. And so by all means, unless you snap the picture and you look at it on the screen and want to do a dance because it's the greatest thing you've ever seen, keep taking pictures. Like I said, move around, look for different perspectives, different angles. I like to say it's not uncommon to find me standing on chairs, tables, climbing trees. Anytime you can get a high angle, that's an angle that's different from what everybody else is going to see. One of the great roles and privileges of being a photojournalist is that I get to be places other people don't get to be. Whether it's, in sports photography, I'm on the sidelines or the baseline of a sporting event. Whether it's in a news situation where all of the general public is back there at the barricade and I get to be right up front with the president or whatever. Enjoy that privilege and use that privilege to serve those people who can't get up close, okay? So I just wanted to show you really quick, right? Where is, forgive me, see if I can get, no, I don't want Aaron, I want Gabby. All right, so real quickly, the Pictures of the Year International is a photo contest run by the University of Missouri. They just had their judging in the last couple of weeks. Actually, I think they may still be judging. Gabrielle Lurie is a photojournalist at the San Francisco Chronicle. She actually just got hired there about a year ago, fairly new out of college. She just won their local photojournalist of the year. POI does 2 photojournalists of the year, a local and an international. So they give an award to somebody who travels all over the world and covers all sorts of stuff, and then they give somebody who works basically just local in their community. Gabby's entire portfolio is made up of short photo stories, okay? And we're going to do a short photo story at the end of the semester, 5 or 7 photographs that tell sort of the story in a sense. But what I want you to do is every time you go out to take a photograph of something, you think of it as if you're trying to shoot a photo story of everything. You want to look for a variety of different angles, a variety of different situations. You want to try to find as many different actions that are part of the story as possible, so that after the fact you can look at your pictures and say, you know, is it that one? Is it that one? Is it that one? You know, it's smartphone editing is a little different than how I do it on my computer, but nonetheless, it's looking at a bunch of pictures and deciding after you've taken them which one actually fits the assignment better. So I just wanted to look at a little bit of what Gabrielle has done with her stories, because most of these are not big, epic, long-form photojournalism. There's a strong tradition in photojournalism of spending days and weeks and months covering one story and producing this photo story that that shows someone progressing, very popular, progressing through any kind of disease. A photographer at the Providence Journal years ago did this incredible story on a local man who had Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, and he was fighting for the right to die. And John spent, I don't even remember now, a couple of years following the progress of this man's disease, from the diagnosis where he was still able to walk around, to the point where he needed a wheelchair, to the point where he was bedridden. But we're talking about a couple of years worth of work. Most of what we do, especially in newspapers, is compressed into a very tight time frame. I'm lucky if I spend an hour with a subject most of the time. If I can spend a week with a subject, that's incredible. But it's a question of how you do that, how you find the time, and how you find the variety of photographs, right? These are her singles. So we're going to move very quickly. So this is a story about a little girl who is living through life having been evicted, her family from their home. And it's just a variety of photographs showing different situations, different activities. You get a feeling of emotion and place. Conflict around the things going on in her life. Here's a beautiful example of using the image in a mirror as a framing element. Another mirror that allows you to see the face of the person you're looking at the back of. So, a tender moment. All right. This is more. There's in the photo story genre, there's also something we call more of a photo essay, which is exploring an issue or a theme that doesn't necessarily follow a specific individual or a specific series of actions, but rather looks at an issue through a variety of different views. So in this case, the photographer looked at a lot of different people and how they deal with the threat to access to abortion in their community. The level of intimacy that she got with this that is really unusual, especially given the medical situation. Medical locations are very difficult to get photographs in. So once again, I'm not expecting any of you to get this kind of work, okay, both from the technical, qualitative standpoint, but also as far as the depth and access. So, but I'm also want you to see that starting where you are now and advancing, there is a point at which the work can be truly powerful and compelling. Gabrielle's portfolio is off the charts. I saw this. I subscribe to the Chronicle because their whole photo staff is really dynamite. They do great work, especially wildfire season. But I remember when she was hired and had seen her work as a student, and she's just really blossomed at this paper. But it's the example, every single one of these photographs is visually different. There's no redundancy. You're not seeing the same person over and over again. You're not seeing multiple pictures of people in stirrups or people in gowns, and yet they're all compelling, right? Here's a very nice, really a very simple story um, about becoming a wildfire fighter, which of course is a hot topic in Northern California. And this is a very traditional, very straightforward photo story. She picked one person, she followed this one person, she told this one person's story. But you see the difference you get in the kinds of photographs. You've got these, we'll go back, you know, this is a wide photograph. This is a scene setter photograph. You've got a lot of information, a lot of background. You know, the faces of the people are very small. But then we move in. In this case, this is what we would call a candid portrait, right? It's not a posed portrait. She didn't sit in there and say, do this, look here. He's sitting in this situation, and she caught this close-up photograph. These are very nice, especially in the story environment, because sometimes there's so much activity you might not get that moment where you can really engage with the person's face and their eyes. This one also has a feeling of emotion in it. This is a detail photograph taken fairly close up, telling part of the story through the fine details, the dirt and the material. You know, this is an action photograph, difficult lighting situation, really telling the story. This is sort of a side moment, right? This is a lighter moment. This is what we would call that slice of life. Outside of the photo story world, this is very much a single news photo, or a single, as I called them, a feature or a slice of life. It's a quiet moment that looks a little at something a little differently. So. This is, I'm trying to remember now, I don't even, where's my explanation? This one. The woman struggling with addiction and I believe trying to maintain custody or contact with her child. So these are really gritty street photographs in some cases, really tender, intimate moments. But you see the variety of distance the photographer gets from the subject, sometimes close, sometimes far away, sometimes in between. A lot of times in photography we talk about short, medium, and far, right? Which is really, quite frankly, exactly a question of how far you feel from the subject. Sometimes those photographs are not necessarily taken from corresponding physical distances. A lot of close photographs may be taken with a telephoto lens. The photographer may still be 10 or 15 feet away. So you have to pay a little bit of attention to the effects of the lens. I mean, this is definitely a wide-angle lens. You know, you can tell the photographer in this case has to be fairly physically close to this person to make this photograph. And same for this one. This photograph, the size of the head of the people is not really significantly different from that first photograph I was looking at, but the photographer is clearly a little farther back, but it's still fairly intimate, right? I believe that was her whole portfolio. So as you can see, her portfolio had like 3 singles at the beginning of the portfolio, single moments, and then the rest of her portfolio were these sort of powerful storytelling collections of photographs. So I would encourage you to go to the POY website. I'll go ahead and throw the link up just in case you don't remember POY.org right off the top. But this is the winners in what they call the daily life category. I call feature or slice of life, right? This is an example. This is not an intimate personal storytelling moment. This is really more about the graphic. Nonetheless, you know, it's a very nice photograph. The red on the pedestrian, it really sort of makes them pop out, but this is about graphic elements. This is essentially a candid portrait again, a kind of a close-up intimate moment that doesn't, you know, doesn't have that wider sense of what the story is visible in the photograph, but this in this case is, a picture of someone smoking marijuana at an event. Another lighter moment, cellists playing music for cattle. I don't know how this happens or where this happens, but I wish someone would play cellos for the cattle in southeastern Connecticut so I could photograph it. This is actually one of my favorite photographs of the year. Jess Rinaldi is a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer at the Boston Globe, and she got to go up to Maine and photograph this 101-year-old woman who still works as a professional lobster fisherman in Maine. It's a great picture. So once again, this is like that first one. This is more of a photograph about a graphic element, and less about an intimate slice of life. But this, on the other hand, is a very intimate slice of life. We saw a lot of these during the pandemic, right? People only able to visit their loved ones in nursing homes through the windows. I think this is one of the best examples I've seen of that photograph, and that is because of the reflection of his face juxtaposing to the expression on her face. So, and eat your heart out, Henri Cartier-Bresson, right? Reflection of person leaping over puddle. I will tell you, I think probably every photographer in the history of time has taken a picture like this or tried to take a picture like this purely because they saw that Cartier-Bresson photograph from the whole decisive moment discussion. So, like I said, take a lot of photographs, not just one. Make sure you move around, try different angles and different perspectives. I think there were a couple of, all right. Next time there's a protest out here on the plaza, see if you can get up in one of the top floors of the building adjacent. See if you can look down on the protest instead of trying to photograph it at the same height you're at. But once again, whenever possible, be in front of the people you're photographing so that we can see their eyes, even if they're not looking right at you, so you can see their emotions, so you can make that human connection to them. And other than that, let me know if you have any questions. I'll throw the POYI link up in course content, so you can go right to that if you want to look at it. And that's it for today.